Hello there, my Twilight dreamers. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Volterra, into the ancient stone and candlelight of the Volturi's throne room, to tell the story of Marcus, the quietest and most tragic of the three kings. A man who once loved more deeply than almost any immortal who ever lived, and who has spent 2,000 years learning to exist in the silence that love left behind. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. Alright, now let's get cozy. Let your shoulders drop. Close your eyes and breathe in very slowly, because tonight we have the entire story of Marcus to drift away to. He was not born into darkness. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Marcus. The most essential truth beneath all the centuries of stillness and silence and grief. Before the cold marble of Volterra, before the crimson robes and the throne and the endless procession of supplicants and condemned, there was a man. A young man living under a sky that had never heard of vampires, in a world that believed its monsters took other shapes entirely. Marcus was born in the ancient Mediterranean world, in an era so distant from the modern age that even the concept of history as a recorded thing was still relatively new. The precise location of his birth has been lost, as most human details are eventually lost to the immortals who lived them, worn smooth by the passage of too many years until only impressions remain rather than specifics. What survived in Marcus, in the rare moments when he allowed himself to remember, was the quality of the light, the particular gold of Mediterranean afternoons, the way the sun fell across stone and water with an almost aggressive warmth, as if it were pressing down on the world with both hands. He remembered heat. He remembered the smell of the sea. He had been, by the standards of his time and place, a thoughtful young man, not a warrior in the way that his era celebrated warriors, not driven by the particular hungers for conquest and glory that animated so many of the men around him. He was observant in the way that certain people are, those for whom the most interesting thing in any room is not the architecture or the food or the politics, but the people, the way they moved around each other, the way a man's eyes shifted when he spoke to someone he loved versus someone he feared, the invisible architecture of human relationship that most people moved through without ever consciously perceiving. This quality, this particular attunement to the bonds between people, was not yet a gift in those human years. It was simply how his mind worked, the lens through which he understood the world. He could walk into a gathering and feel almost immediately which friendships were genuine and which were performed, which marriages were built on real affection, and which were arrangements wearing the costume of love. It did not make him cynical. If anything, it made him tender toward the genuine connections he observed, deeply appreciative of real feeling in a world that contained a great deal of its opposite. He was perhaps 20 years old by the rough reckoning that his era applied to such things when everything changed. The man who would become Aro was already ancient by then, though he wore his immortality with a particular ease of someone who had spent considerable time learning to appear as something other than what he was. He had been wandering for centuries by the time he encountered Marcus, moving through the ancient world with a curiosity that had not dimmed despite the years, collecting knowledge and power and promising individuals with the same focused appetite. He found Marcus the way he found most things worth having, by paying attention, by being patient, by recognizing quality before it had fully revealed itself. What Aro saw in the young man was potential. He could read every thought Marcus had ever entertained simply by touching his hand, could access the full library of his inner life in an instant, and what he found there was something genuinely rare. A mind of unusual perceptiveness, an emotional intelligence that operated almost like a separate sense, and beneath it all, a quality of steadiness, of endurance, that suggested this was someone who would survive transformation intact. Not all humans did. The burning remade people, and sometimes what emerged was unrecognizable from what had gone in. Aro had learned to choose carefully. Marcus did not choose transformation in the way that the word choice implies genuine agency. He was young, and the world was dark, and Aro was very persuasive. And the offer of something beyond ordinary mortality in an era when ordinary mortality was often brutal and brief was not easy to refuse. There was fear, certainly. There was the particular terror of the unknown that no amount of eloquent explanation could fully dissolve. But there was also something else, something Marcus would only understand later. A sense of recognition, as if this were a door he had always been walking toward, without knowing it existed. The transformation was 3 days of fire, as it always was, as it always would be for every vampire who came after. Marcus endured it the way he endured most difficult things, by going very still and very inward, by retreating to some quiet center of himself and waiting for it to end. He didn't scream, though the urge was overwhelming. He did not beg or bargain or lose himself entirely to the pain. He simply burned and continued to exist within the burning, and came out the other side as something that retained the essential shape of who he had been while being entirely remade. When his eyes opened for the first time on the world as an immortal, the first thing he understood was the silence. Not the silence of sound, because the world was suddenly and overwhelmingly loud. Every heartbeat and footstep and murmured conversation reaching him with crystalline clarity. But the silence of his own heart, the absolute stillness at the center of his chest where a lifetime of rhythm had simply ceased. He lay in the dark of the room Aro had prepared and listened to his own heartlessness and understood, in a way that was both abstract and viscerally immediate, that he was genuinely no longer human. The thirst came next, as it always did, a burning in his throat that was both familiar and entirely unlike anything he had known in life. Aro was there, patient and attentive, guiding him through the first hunt with the practiced care of someone who had done this before. The animal blood that Marcus took in those first days was barely sufficient. The fire in his throat banked but not extinguished, but it was enough to keep him functional. enough to keep his attention on learning rather than in the consuming need to feed. And then the gift manifested, and everything changed. It came to him gradually over the first weeks of his immortal life, like eyes adjusting to a new kind of light. He had always been perceptive about the bonds between people, but this was something categorically beyond that human sensitivity. He began to see them, not with his eyes precisely, not as visible threads in the literal sense, but with a perception that had no human analogue, a sense that operated alongside sight and sound and smell as a distinct source of information about the world. The connections between people presented themselves to his awareness with startling clarity, each one distinct in its character and intensity, readable in a way that ordinary emotions and motivations were not. He could see, with a precision that was almost overwhelming in its detail, the exact nature of every relationship in his immediate vicinity, the strength of a bond, its quality, whether it was founded on genuine love or on need or on habit or on fear, whether it was growing or fading or suspended in some careful equilibrium. He could see loyalty, and he could see resentment beneath loyalty, and he could see love so deep it had become indistinguishable from identity. He could see manipulation, and he could see the particular tragedy of people who had convinced themselves that need was love. In those early weeks, the world was almost too loud with it. Every interaction he witnessed was layered with this additional dimension of information, and learning to manage the input, to process it without being overwhelmed, took time and considerable concentration. Aro was fascinated, reading everything Marcus perceived through the touch of his hand, understanding immediately the extraordinary strategic value of what his new companion could do. Caius came to them within that first decade, drawn into the constellation of their small coven through circumstances that were partly chance and partly Aro's careful management. He was older in his immortality than Marcus, more settled in his nature, carrying already the particular sharpness of someone who had been hurt enough times to decide that the solution was to become the thing that did the hurting. Marcus's gift showed him the threads of their new companion's inner life with uncomfortable clarity. There was genuine intellect there, genuine capability, and a loyalty to Aro that was real even if it was entangled with calculation. But there was also something wound tight and cold at the center of Caius, something that had contracted around an old wound and never fully relaxed. The three of them together were not yet what the Volturi would become. They were simply a coven, unusual in its coherence, and unusual in the complementary nature of its members' gifts, but still just three vampires navigating the ancient world, without the formal structure or the explicit ambition that would come later. They moved through the Mediterranean with a freedom that was possible in that era, when the world was large enough and human communication slow enough, that three impossibly beautiful and impossibly dangerous beings could exist among mortal populations, without the mechanisms of exposure that the modern world would eventually construct. Marcus learned the world as an immortal during those early centuries, the way all new vampires did, by accumulating experience faster than they could fully integrate it, by making mistakes and surviving them, by gradually constructing the layer of control that separated functional immortal existence from the consuming chaos of pure instinct. The thirst was always there, the constant companion of every vampire's existence, but he learned to manage it, learned the rhythms of hunting and restraint that kept it from overwhelming everything else. What he noticed in those early and relatively unclouded years was that his gift was not merely useful, it was beautiful in its way. The bonds between people, when they were genuine, had a quality that his perception registered as something close to luminous. A mated pair with a real and deep connection was extraordinary to witness, the threads between them thick and bright and complex, wound through with years of shared experience and genuine knowledge of each other. A parent's love for a child, even among the vampires they occasionally encountered, had a particular quality, a completeness that was unlike any other bond he observed. He watched the world through this additional sense, with the same quality of tender attention he had brought to it as a human, and he found that immortality had not changed the essential thing. The connections between people were still the most interesting thing in any room. They were still the truest measure of what was actually happening beneath the surface of every interaction. And occasionally, rarely, he observed bonds of such extraordinary quality that they stayed with him for decades afterward. Reference points for what genuine connection could be. He did not yet know that he was cataloguing something against which he would one day measure his own loss. The decade turned, and the small coven grew in influence and in purpose, and the world they inhabited began to take the shape of something deliberate. Aro's ambitions clarified and expanded. Caius's tactical mind engaged with the architecture of power in ways that were genuinely useful. And Marcus, quiet and observant, and possessed of a gift that could see through pretense to the truth of any alliance, found his place in the structure they were building together. He was not unhappy. That deserves to be said plainly, because what came later can make it easy to imagine that Marcus was always the hollowed figure he became, that the grief was always there waiting for him. It were not. In those early centuries, before everything changed, Marcus was as alive as an immortal could be. He had purpose and companionship, and the endless fascination of a world, observed through a gift that made ordinary existence feel layered and rich. He had Aro's brilliant and sometimes exhausting company, and Caius's acerbic intelligence, and the slowly accumulating weight of experience that was the particular gift and particular burden of immortal life. He had, though he did not yet know to call it that, a future. It arrived in the form of a woman with a gift for happiness and eyes the color of autumn, and it changed everything he had ever understood about what it meant to exist. She came into his awareness the way certain things do, not all at once but gradually, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves away from the sun. Not a sudden brightness, but a slow and certain warming, a shift in the quality of everything, so that after a while you could no longer quite remember what the room had felt like before. Didyme was Aro's sister. That fact alone made her presence in the coven both natural and complicated, because everything connected to Aro carried that particular double quality, the surface and the layer beneath the surface, the gift and the cost of the gift. She had been human in the same era as her brother, had grown up in the same household, had moved through the same ancient world. And when Aro had finally chosen to transform her, After decades of careful consideration about the risks and the rewards, what emerged from those 3 days of fire was someone who defied every expectation he had constructed around her. She was not what Marcus had anticipated. He had expected someone shaped by Aro, carrying his particular intensity and his particular hungers, marked by the same relentless curiosity and appetite for accumulation. Siblings often rhymed with each other in his experience, the same essential nature expressed through slightly different instruments. But Didyme was not a variation on her brother's theme. She was something entirely her own, where Aro moved through the world as if cataloguing it, assessing everything he encountered for its potential value and utility. Didyme simply inhabited it. She was present in a way that very few immortals manage to be, genuinely there in each moment rather than perpetually calculating the next one. She noticed things that had no strategic value whatsoever. The way a particular quality of evening light fell across the hills outside Volterra, the sound of water moving over stone in the river below the city, the precise shade of color in the sky in the minutes before full dark, that liminal blue that belonged to neither day nor night. Her gift was happiness, not the performance of it, not the social mask that most people wore to manage the impressions they made on the world, but the genuine article, radiating from her like warmth from a banked fire. Those who spent time near Didyme found themselves lighter, easier, more inclined toward pleasure and contentment than their circumstances might otherwise warrant. It was not manipulation, or at least it did not feel like manipulation. It felt like standing in sunlight. It felt like being reminded that existence contained good things, that there were reasons, beneath all the difficulty and the danger and the endless complications of immortal life, to find one situation acceptable, even pleasant. For the other members of the coven, her gift was a relief. The atmosphere in Volterra, even in those relatively early years before the Volturi had fully consolidated their power, carried a particular weight. Aro's ambitions generated tension. Caius's barely managed bitterness generated something colder than tension. The guard members who came and went brought their own histories, their own damages, their own complicated relationships with a life none of them had been designed for. Didyme moved through all of it like weather moving through a landscape, not changing its fundamental nature but softening its edges, making it possible to breathe. For Marcus, her effect was something categorically different. He noticed it first through his gift, which was both the most honest and the most painful way to notice anything. He had grown accustomed, over the decades of his immortal life, to reading the bonds around him as a kind of ongoing background information, the way one becomes accustomed to the sounds of a place one inhabits, hearing them without actively listening, the threads between Aro and the guard members, the complex and layered connection between Aro and Caius, the transient and often thin bonds between nomads who pass through and the coven that assess them. He had not, until Didyme, turned that perception on himself with any particular attention. The first time he did, what he found startled him into absolute stillness for a long moment, which was notable for someone who was already very still. The thread between himself and Didyme was unlike anything he had observed in his years of watching other relationships form and develop. It was not yet what it would become, not in those early weeks of her presence in the coven, but it had a quality, even then, that distinguished it from every other bond he could perceive in his immediate world. A clarity, a depth that seemed disproportionate to the time they had actually spent together, as if the connection were drawing on some resource beyond ordinary experience, as if it recognized something that their conscious minds were only beginning to approach. He did not say anything about this. The perception felt too private, too significant to offer up to conversation. He simply continued to exist in Didyme's vicinity with a new attentiveness, watching the thread between them with the same careful and slightly awed attention that one brings to something rare that might vanish if approached too quickly. What he learned about her in those weeks, he learned the way he learned most things, through observation and patience rather than direct inquiry. She was curious about him. That became clear early and pleased him in ways he did not immediately examine. Most people found Marcus somewhat difficult to know, not because he was cold or deliberately closed, but because his particular form of attentiveness, the quality of attention he brought to watching the world, could feel unnerving to those who were not accustomed to being genuinely observed. Didyme did not find it unnerving. She found it interesting. She asked him questions that no one else thought to ask, not about his gift, which everyone wanted to understand because of its utility, but about his experience of it, what it was like to perceive the world through that additional layer of information, whether it ever became overwhelming, the constant awareness of what everyone around him truly felt about everyone else, whether there were bonds he had observed that he found particularly beautiful, and if so, what made them beautiful to him specifically. He answered her honestly, which was itself unusual. He was not accustomed to being asked questions that required genuine introspection rather than information, and finding that he wanted to answer, that her curiosity felt like something he wanted to meet with equivalent openness, surprised him. Their conversations began to extend. What had started as brief exchanges became long, unhurried discussions that moved through topics with the particular ease of two people who discover that their minds move at compatible speeds. She was intelligent in a way that was different from Aro's intelligence, less acquisitive and more contemplative, interested in ideas for their texture and implication rather than their tactical application. She thought about the nature of immortal existence with a philosophical openness that Marcus found genuinely refreshing after centuries of Aro's calculating assessments and Caius's bitter pragmatism. He began, without consciously deciding to arrange his time around the possibility of her presence. The thread between them changed as the weeks became months. He could feel it shifting, deepening, developing the complexity that came with genuine accumulated knowledge of another person. It was no longer simply a bright potential. It had become something structural, something that felt like part of the architecture of his existence rather than an addition to it. When she was not nearby, her absence registered not as neutral, but as something subtly wrong, the way a familiar sound becomes noticeable only when it stops. He understood what was happening. His gift had shown him this process in dozens of other relationships, had let him observe the way genuine love formed and settled and became essential. He had watched it from the outside for decades and had developed a scholar's understanding of its stages and textures. But understanding a thing from the outside and experiencing it from the inside turned out to be almost entirely unlike each other, in the way that knowing the theory of fire and being warm were related but distinct. Didyme's awareness of him shifted in the same period, though she expressed it differently with a directness that was characteristic of her. She did not observe and wait. She simply, one afternoon in the quiet hours when the coven's various activities had scattered everyone else to different parts of the compound, sat beside him and said that she had been thinking about him with a frequency that seemed to warrant acknowledgement. The honesty of it made something in him that had been held very carefully begin to release. What followed was not dramatic, not in the external sense. They were not demonstrative in the way that some immortal couples were, those matched pairs whose bond expressed itself in constant physical proximity and loud mutual devotion. Their love was quieter than that, more interior, built from conversation and from the particular pleasure of being genuinely known by another person. From the experience, remarkable for Marcus, of having his own inner life reflected back to him by someone who had actually paid attention to it. He told her about his human life, the fragmentary impressions that were all that remained of it, the quality of the light and the smell of the sea, and the way he had always noticed the invisible structures between people. She listened with a complete attention that was one of her essential qualities, asking the occasional question that suggested she was building a real picture rather than simply being polite. And she told him things in return, things about her experience of her own gift, the way it sometimes felt like a responsibility rather than a simple pleasure, the awareness that the happiness she generated in others was not quite the same as happiness she had chosen to give. There was one thing she told him that he returned to often in the long centuries after, turning it in his mind the way one turns a stone that catches the light differently from different angles. She said that when she was near him, her gift felt different than it did anywhere else, not absent, not diminished, but changed in quality, as if the happiness it generated was less a radiation outward and more a genuine internal warmth, something that started in her rather than moving through her from some external source. She said it felt near him, like her gift was finally working on herself. He understood what she meant before she finished the sentence, because his own gift was showing him the same truth from a different angle. The thread between them had reached by that point a depth and clarity that he had only previously observed in the oldest and most established of mated pairs, bonds that had been built over centuries of shared life. That it had formed so completely, so quickly, with such evident permanence, told him something about the nature of what this was. Some bonds, his centuries of observation had suggested, were not really built at all. They were recognized. Two people encountering each other and finding that the connection was already there, waiting, as if the relationship had existed in potential before either of them had arrived. They spoke eventually about leaving. The idea formed between them gradually, the way the bond itself had formed, through accumulation and quiet mutual recognition. The Volturi was Aro's project, Aro's architecture, Aro's ambition scaled to the dimensions of the entire vampire world. Marcus had served it willingly, had found genuine purpose in the utility of his gift to the coven's governance, had valued the companionship and the structure, but it had never been, at the deepest level, his dream. And Didyme had never wanted power, she had been drawn into the Volturi's orbit by virtue of her blood connection to its architect, not by any desire of her own for dominion or recognition. What she wanted, she told him simply, was warmth. A place with actual sunlight, or at least the memory of sunlight, somewhere south and quiet where the world moved at a human pace, and there was time to simply exist without the constant weight of governance and judgment and the management of other people's dangerous natures. What she wanted, she said, was a life that was actually theirs. He wanted it too. He felt it clearly, the desire for something smaller and more genuine than the edifice they inhabited. A life built to the scale of two people rather than the scale of an empire. He could see the thread of their shared future in the way he could sometimes see the shape of a bond before it had fully formed. A potential that was more than speculation, that had the quality of something already decided. He should have recognized the danger in that wanting, should have understood that Aro, who could read every thought he had ever entertained and who had observed their bond developing with the same attentiveness he brought to everything that might affect the Volturi's interests, was also watching that future take shape, was already calculating what it would cost him, was already arriving in the cold and private corridors of his own mind at a conclusion that Marcus would not learn for a very long time. But in those last warm months before everything ended, Marcus did not see it coming. He was too full of something he had not expected to feel, something his centuries of observing other people's happiness had not quite prepared him for. He was in love genuinely and completely, in the way that his gift had always told him was the rarest and most extraordinary thing in the world. And the world, for the first time in his long immortal life, felt like something he had been given, rather than something he was simply passing through. He did not know it was almost over. He did not know that the most important thread his gift had ever shown him was about to be cut. He was, for those last few months, simply happy. Aro had always been kind to Didyme. That was the thing Marcus would return to in the long centuries after, with the particular obsessive quality that grief brings to detail. The small memories that should have been unremarkable, but became, in retrospect, unbearable. Aro had always been kind to his sister, attentive, interested in her happiness in the way that older siblings sometimes are, carrying a residual protectiveness from a human childhood that immortality had not entirely dissolved. He had smiled at her genuinely, had listened to her with patience, had touched her hand with what appeared, to any ordinary observer, to be real and uncomplicated affection. Marcus had observed all of this through his gift, and he had seen nothing that alarmed him. The thread between Aro and Didyme was genuine. That was the cruelest part of it, the detail that made the eventual truth so difficult to absorb. Aro had loved his sister, had loved her in the real and verifiable sense that Marcus's gift had always been able to distinguish from its counterfeits. The love had been there, bright and unmistakable in the threads between them, real enough that Marcus had trusted it completely. He had not understood then that love and the willingness to commit an act of profound violence against its object were not mutually exclusive, that someone could genuinely love another person and still make the calculation that their continued existence was too costly, that the heart and the mind could arrive at entirely different conclusions, and that sometimes, in certain people, the mind won absolutely, and finally, and without visible struggle. That was perhaps the most frightening thing about what Aro had done. Not that he had acted from hatred or jealousy or some consuming darkness that had overwhelmed his better nature. He had acted from clarity, from the same cool and comprehensive intelligence that made him so effective at everything else he turned his attention toward. He had assessed the situation, had weighed what he stood to lose against what he could not afford to lose, and he had made a decision. The decision had been made the way Aro made all important decisions, with thoroughness and with patience, and with a complete absence of the kind of emotional interference that might have led a lesser mind to a different conclusion. Marcus had not seen it coming. That failure of perception would stay with him longer than almost anything else, longer even than the specific memory of loss, because it implicated something he had always believed about himself and about his gift. He had thought, in the way that those of us who are good at perceiving truth in the world around us sometimes naively assume, that he would know, that the threads between Aro and himself, the threads between Aro and Didyme, would have shown him something, if there had been something to show, a shadow in the connection, a quality of concealment or calculation that differed from Aro's ordinary mode of being. Something. There had been nothing, or rather, there had been everything that was always there. Aro's genuine affection and genuine appreciation and genuine desire to maintain the coven's strength and coherence, all of it present and readable and real. The problem, Marcus eventually understood, was that all of those things were true simultaneously with a decision that contradicted them. Aro had loved Didyme and had decided to kill her, and both of those facts had coexisted in him without apparent friction, because Aro's relationship with moral contradiction was not one of friction, but of accommodation. He had simply made room for both. The period before Didyme's death had been, from the outside, unremarkable. The coven continued its routines. Aro continued his management of the Volturi's expanding influence, the careful political work of consolidating their position as the governing authority of the vampire world. Caius continued his various expressions of focused hostility toward a world he had never fully accepted, his particular brand of bitterness finding useful outlet in the enforcement activities the Volturi's growing authority required. The guard maintained their positions, came and went on assignments, returned with news from the wider vampire world that Aro catalogued and assessed with his usual comprehensive appetite. Marcus and Didyme continued to exist in the particular warmth of their bond, planning quietly, speaking in the evenings about the life they intended to build somewhere south and sun-warmed and entirely their own. She'd been happy in those final weeks. Genuinely, radiantly, characteristically happy, the thread between them carrying her contentment to him with the clarity it always had. She had believed their departure was imminent. She had spoken about it with a lightness in her voice, that particular quality she had when something she wanted was finally becoming real rather than theoretical. Soon, she had said to him one evening, when the light through the tall windows was turning the stone walls of Volterra the color of old honey, "I can feel it. We're almost ready to go." He'd agreed. He'd felt it too, the nearness of their leaving, the sense that the future they had chosen was finally close enough to touch. He had looked at her in that warm light and felt the thread between them with a vividness that he would later understand was the universe offering him a last clear look at the thing he was about to lose. He had not known to treat it as a farewell. He had simply been present in it, grateful in the uncomplicated way that people are grateful for things they do not yet know they are about to lose. He did not know that Aro had already decided. What happened to Didyme was not witnessed. That absence of witnessing was itself part of the architecture of what Aro did, the careful construction of a disappearance rather than an observable event. There was no confrontation, no argument, no moment that Marcus could later point to and say, "There, that is where it happened. That is the scene where the before ended and the after began." She was present, and then she was not. The coven was told with the quiet grief of a bereaved brother, performed with Aro's characteristic conviction, that Didyme had chosen to leave, that she had gone, as some immortals eventually did, in search of something the Volturi life could not provide, that she had said her farewells privately and departed before dawn, slipping away without ceremony, because that was, Aro suggested, with a sorrow that appeared entirely genuine, simply the way she had wanted it. It was a thin story. Marcus knew it was thin even as he heard it, even through the first terrible shock of her absence. But the shock was so complete, so overwhelming, that the thinness of the story was a detail he could not hold on to. He could not hold on to anything in those first moments. He was drowning in something much larger than the capacity to analyze narrative inconsistencies, because his gift had already shown him the truth before the words were finished. The thread between himself and Didyme, which he had felt every moment of every day for years, which had become as constant and as fundamental to his perception of the world as the ground beneath his feet, was gone. Not faded, not distant, not the attenuated quality of a bond stretched across great geographic distance, which had its own recognizable texture, a thinning and a muting that still preserved the essential shape of the connection. Gone. Severed. The absolute unmistakable silence of a connection that had not been broken but destroyed, that had not simply moved beyond his range, but had ceased to exist at the level where existence itself was the question. He had observed Bond's savor before, in his years of watching the world through his gift. He had seen the slow dissolution of relationships that had run their course, the gradual dimming that came with the natural end of connection. He had seen the sharp and violent severance that came with death, that specific quality of abrupt termination that was unlike any other change a bond could undergo. He had always known the difference. His gift had always been precise about this particular distinction, reliable in a way that he had come to depend on as completely as he depended on any of his senses. Didyme had not left. Didyme was dead. He did not accuse Aro. Not then, not directly, not in any way that would have required him to voice the knowledge aloud and make it solid and irrevocable in the world, rather than a devastation that was still, in some part of him, being refused. He stood in the room where Aro delivered his careful account of his sister's departure, and he felt the world reorganize itself around an absence that was absolute and permanent and incomprehensible, and he said nothing. He looked at Aro's face, at the performed grief that was so convincing because it was not entirely performed, because Aro genuinely mourned his sister, even as he had been the one to destroy her, and he felt something in himself that had no name in any language he had ever encountered. "She loved you deeply," Aro said, his voice carrying that particular quality of sorrow that he wore so well. "She wanted you to know that. She said to tell you that the life she imagined with you was the most beautiful thing she had ever considered." Marcus heard the words and understood that they were probably true, that Aro had likely spoken to Didyme before the end, had perhaps even given her the opportunity to say the things she would have wanted said, and that understanding, rather than providing any comfort, simply deepened the particular horror of what he was absorbing, that it could have been done with such care, that the cruelty and the consideration could have coexisted so completely. He said nothing. He turned and walked out of the room, and no one followed him, and that was perhaps the last mercy of that terrible day. In the weeks that followed, something happened to Marcus that he would not fully recognize until much later, when grief had settled enough to allow for a kind of retrospective clarity. Chelsea found him. Chelsea was one of Aro's most valued and most carefully managed members of the guard, possessed of a gift that operated on the bonds between people with a precision and subtlety that made it among the most powerful abilities in the Volturi's considerable arsenal. She could strengthen existing bonds, reinforce loyalties that were beginning to waver, weave entirely new attachments where none naturally existed. She could also, when required, dissolve connections that had become inconvenient, softening the threads of feeling that bound one person to another until they loosened and fell away, without the person ever quite understanding why their feelings had changed. She worked quietly, without announcement, her gift functioning below the threshold of conscious awareness in the people she worked on. They did not feel themselves being altered. They simply found over time that the landscape of their loyalties had shifted in ways that felt entirely natural and self-generated, that certain attachments had become stronger and certain impulses had softened, that the world arranged itself around different centers than it might otherwise have done. It was elegant and it was thorough, and it was, Marcus would eventually understand, among the most profound violations that one person could commit against another. Aro sent her to Marcus in the weeks after Didyme's death, presenting her presence as comfort and companionship, deploying her gift with the same strategic care he brought to every resource at his disposal. What she did to Marcus was bind him, carefully, thoroughly, layer by layer, working with the grief itself as her foundation, building around that enormous and consuming devastation new structures of attachment to the Volturi, to Aro, to the throne, and the centuries of shared purpose, and the life that was, despite everything, the only life Marcus now had. She took the place that had been emptied by Didyme's death, not by filling it, because nothing could fill it, but by surrounding it with walls of manufactured loyalty, so that the emptiness could not become the exit it might otherwise have been. Without Chelsea's intervention, Marcus might have left, might have collapsed entirely, or might have done something dangerous in the initial rawness of his grief, something that would have required Aro to address it in the way he had addressed Didyme. Chelsea ensured that neither of those outcomes occurred. She bound him to his place with invisible threads that felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from genuine belonging. Marcus's own gift would eventually show him what had been done. He would perceive, in the threads of his connection to the Volturi, a quality that was not quite organic, a reinforcement that had not grown naturally over time, but had been placed there from outside with great skill and considerable care. He would recognize Chelsea's particular signature in the structure of those bonds, the subtle difference between a connection that had developed through genuine shared experience and one that had been constructed to resemble it. He would know, and knowing, he would do nothing, because Chelsea's work was thorough enough that even the knowledge of it could not fully dissolve its effects, and because by the time he understood what had been done, enough genuine time had passed, enough centuries of actual shared existence had accumulated, that the manufactured loyalty had been supplemented by something that was at least partly real. The Volturi was his life. It had been his life for so long that the question of whether he would have chosen it, absent Chelsea's intervention, had become theoretical in the way that most questions about paths not taken eventually become theoretical. He had not confronted Arrow directly. What he had done instead was arrive, over the slow months following Didyme's death, at a knowledge that settled into him like sediment finding the bottom of still water, dense and permanent, and no longer agitated by the currents above it. He knew what Arrow had done. He knew why. He understood the calculation with the complete and terrible clarity of someone whose gift had always made other people's motivations transparent, and he understood that the calculation had been, from Arrow's perspective, correct. Marcus was more valuable to the Volturi than Didyme had been. Her loss was the price of his continued presence, and Arrow had paid it without hesitation and with genuine sorrow and without a moment's genuine doubt. He understood all of it, and he folded that understanding somewhere very deep inside himself, beneath the grief and beneath the manufactured loyalty, and beneath the centuries of accumulated numbness that would gradually insulate him from the sharpest edges of what he knew. And he continued. He took his place on the throne. He performed his function. He spoke when spoken to and voted when votes were required, and brought his gift to bear on the governance of a world he no longer felt himself to be genuinely part of. The warmth that Didyme had always carried with her, the happiness that had been the expression of her gift and the most essential quality of her presence, lingered in the corridors of Volterra for a surprisingly long time after she was gone. Marcus noticed it fading, day by day, the way the warmth fades in the stones of a hearth, long after the fire has gone out, slowly and then all at once, until one day you press your hand to the stone and there is nothing there but cold. He pressed his hand to the cold stone and understood that this was what the rest of forever felt like. And then he sat down on his throne, and the centuries began. There is a particular quality to immortal grief that has no human equivalent, and this is not because immortals feel more deeply than humans do, or because the love that precedes the grief is somehow larger or more significant. It is simply a matter of time. Human grief, however devastating in its immediate experience, exists within a container. The body ages, the brain changes. The neurological pathways that carry pain are gradually, mercifully, rewritten by the accumulating experience of continued living, by new relationships and new purposes, and the slow biological insistence on forward movement that is built into mortal existence at the cellular level. Humans are designed, in the deepest architectural sense, to eventually survive their losses. Vampires are not. The transformation that creates an immortal preserves everything. That is its essential nature, the fundamental trait at the center of what it means to exist without aging, without changing, without the biological processes that carry humans through their grief and out the other side. Everything is kept. The memories do not soften with time. The neural pathways do not quietly rewrite themselves. The capacity for pain is not gradually redirected toward new objects. What is felt at the moment of loss is felt with only minimal diminishment a century later, 2 centuries later, 10 centuries later. The grief does not deepen, but it does not heal either. It simply persists, perfectly preserved, as vivid in his 10,000th visitation as it was in his first. Marcus understood this in an abstract sense before Didyme died. His centuries of observing the immortal world had shown him its effects in others. The particular quality of stillness that settled over vampires who had suffered significant loss and never found their way through it. He had observed it with the scholarly compassion that characterized his relationship to most things he could see clearly, but not change. He had felt something like sympathy for those frozen figures, those immortals who had become monuments to their own suffering. He had not understood that he was looking at his own future. The first decade after Didyme's death was the most acute. That is the only word that serves, acute, because the grief in those early years had a sharpness to it, a presence in every moment that was almost physical in its insistence. He moved through the routines of Volterra, as if moving through deep water, each action requiring a disproportionate expenditure of will. He sat on his throne. He observed the supplicants and the accused and the ambitious, who came before the Volturi with their requests and their confessions and their carefully managed presentations of innocence. He used his gift when Aro asked him to, reporting what he perceived in the threads between the people before him with the same quiet precision he had always brought to that function. He ate. He hunted when the thirst became impossible to ignore, which was less frequently than it once had been, because even the thirst had somehow become muted, as if the grief had settled over all his other appetites like a heavy cloth, dampening everything beneath it. The other guard members brought him prey sometimes, in those first years, concerned in their various ways about the noticeable dimming of someone who had once, if never loud or demonstrative, at least been genuinely present. He accepted their offerings without particular gratitude and without particular resistance, consuming what was brought to him with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing maintenance on a body they were no longer sure they wanted to keep. His gift, in those early years of grief, was the cruelest thing about his existence. It had always been a form of beauty to him. This ability to perceive the bonds between people, to see the invisible architecture of connection that structured every relationship in his vicinity. He had found it fascinating and occasionally overwhelming and sometimes deeply moving, but never in all his centuries of living with it had he found it truly painful. It had been his way of understanding the world, as natural and as value-neutral as sight. After Didyme, it became a form of sustained torment. Every bond he perceived was a reminder. Every strong and genuine connection he observed in the people who came before the Volturi throne was a direct and unavoidable confrontation with what he had lost. A mated pair standing before the kings their threads wound together with a specific complexity of long and genuine partnership, was not something Marcus could observe with detachment. He felt the quality of their connection the way a man with an open wound feels the air, not with the clean appreciation he had once brought to the observation of beautiful bonds, but with a rawness that made even the most casual perception an act of endurance. He developed strategies: narrow his perception, focus on the specific threads relevant to whatever judgment Aro required, rather than allowing his gift to operate at its natural breadth. Assess loyalty and deception and the quality of the specific bonds under examination, report his findings, and then pull back, withdraw his perception to the smallest functional range, avoid the fuller picture that showed him too much of what the world contained, and he no longer had any part of. It worked, partially. It allowed him to function, but it also changed him in ways he did not fully track at the time, ways that only became apparent across the longer span of decades. The deliberate narrowing of his perception, repeated over years and then centuries, gradually became habitual rather than effortful. The withdrawal, which had begun as a coping mechanism, became his default mode. He stopped, without consciously deciding to stop, engaging with the fuller range of what his gift could show him. The world contracted to the dimensions of the immediately necessary, and everything outside those dimensions simply ceased to register. Caius noticed. He said nothing directly, because directness in the Volturi's inner circle was reserved for formal contexts, and Caius's particular brand of communication tended toward the oblique and the pointed, rather than the openly concerned. But Marcus observed, in the threads of Caius's attention toward him during those early decades, something that he eventually identified as a kind of wary recognition. Caius knew something about damage, had his own relationship with the cold aftermath of ancient injury, his own strategies for continuing to exist inside a life that had not turned out to contain what he had once hoped it might. He looked at Marcus in those years with the specific quality of attention that one gives to a mirror when the reflection is uncomfortable. He never said, "I understand." But the understanding was there in the threads, quiet and unexpressed, and Marcus found it neither comforting nor aggravating, simply noted it, the way he noted most things in those years, as information that arrived and was registered and produced no particular response. Aro's management of him was careful. This was, Marcus understood, partly genuine concern and partly strategic maintenance of a valuable asset, and the two motivations coexisted in Aro's behavior toward him, with the same seamless integration that characterized everything Aro did. He was given latitude, not pressed for more engagement than he offered, not required to perform an animation he no longer possessed. Aro spoke to him with the specific gentleness of someone who understood, on some level, the magnitude of what had been lost, even if that understanding coexisted with the knowledge that he had been the one to cause the loss. Chelsea's bonds held through all of it. Marcus could feel them, once he had the clarity to perceive them, as a kind of structural support woven through the ordinary fabric of his connection to the Volturi. They were not the reason he stayed. By the time the first century had passed, remaining was simply the shape his existence had taken, and the question of leaving had become as abstract as the question of flight. He stayed because staying was what he did. because the throne and the stone corridors and the particular quality of Volterra's ancient darkness were the known quantity in a world that had lost most of its meaning, and known quantities, however inadequate, have a gravity that empty freedom does not. The guard members changed over the centuries, some staying for long periods and some passing through more briefly. Marcus observed them all with the diminished but still functional perception that remained to him. He noted their qualities without particular investment. Jane and Alec arrived in the earlier medieval centuries, the twins whose combined gifts represented perhaps the most significant acquisition the Volturi had made in a considerable time. Marcus had watched Aro's careful cultivation of them with the detached recognition of someone observing a familiar process. He had perceived in their threads the particular bond of siblings who had survived extraordinary violence together, a closeness wound through with shared trauma and mutual protectiveness that was genuinely powerful, genuinely real. He had felt nothing in particular about their arrival, not resentment, not warmth, not the complex mixture of appreciation and wariness that their gifts might reasonably have inspired. Simply noted their presence as he noted everything, as a fact of his environment that required no particular response. Heidi came later, and her gift for attraction made her immediately and obviously valuable in the practical management of the Volturi's feeding arrangements. Dimitri's tracking ability made him invaluable for the enforcement functions the guard required. Felix provided the physical power that certain situations demanded. Each of them was a piece of a system that functioned, that continued to function regardless of whether Marcus was genuinely present within it, and that self-sufficiency was perhaps the quality he appreciated most about the life he was living. It did not require much from him. It asked for his gift, his presence, his vote when votes were needed. It did not ask for him to feel anything about any of it. He found, across the centuries, that there were things he still did, small and mostly private things that represented whatever remained of his engagement with existence. He read sometimes in the long, quiet hours of the night, not with the consuming appetite that Aro brought to knowledge, not with any desire to accumulate or to understand strategically, but with the dull and habitual comfort of someone who had once genuinely loved ideas and could still, at sufficient remove, find a faint echo of that love in the right text. Ancient things mostly, works from the era he had been born into, writing from the world that had existed before any of what he had become, before all of it. He read them the way one visits a place from childhood, not expecting to feel at home, but finding a kind of recognition in the specific texture of the familiar. He watched the seasons change over Volterra when he was near enough to a window to observe them. The way the light shifted across the hills outside the city as the year turned, the way the stone of the walls took different colors depending on the quality of the afternoon. He had always noticed light as a human and as an immortal, and that capacity had not entirely been extinguished even in his hollowness. He would find himself, sometimes, paused at a window in the long Volterra evenings, watching the sky perform its unremarkable daily transition from light to dark, and he would feel, briefly and at great distance, something that might have been the memory of appreciation. It was not happiness. It was not even peace exactly. It was simply the faintest remaining trace of someone who had once found the world beautiful, surfacing occasionally through the accumulated sediment of centuries of grief, proving only that the person who had felt that beauty had not been entirely erased, only buried, perfectly preserved in the way that everything in an immortal is perfectly preserved and therefore perfectly inaccessible, sealed beneath the weight of everything that had happened since. The centuries accumulated. The world outside Volterra changed in ways that were dramatic and rapid by historical standards. Transformations that compressed into decades what previous eras had stretched across millennia. Marcus observed these changes with the mild and distant interest of someone watching weather through thick glass. They were real and they were significant, and they required the Volturi to adapt in various practical ways. But they did not touch him, not in any deeper sense, not in the place where touching would have required something to still be alive. He continued. That was the word for it, the most precise and the least adorned. He continued. He sat on his throne and used his gift, and voted when asked, and moved through the days with the steady and effectless persistence of water moving through stone. Not dramatically, not tragically, in the operatic sense that human stories about grief tended to prefer, just quietly and completely, and without any particular expectation that this would ever change. He had been, before, Didyme, a man who believed in the possibility of meaning. He had seen it too clearly in the bonds between people, in the threads of genuine love and loyalty that structured the best of what both human and immortal life could produce. To doubt that it existed, after her, he carried that knowledge the way one carries the memory of warmth after stepping out of sunlight. The knowledge that it had been real, that it had existed, that somewhere in the world, at this very moment, other people were experiencing the thing he could no longer reach. It was, in its quiet way, the most complete devastation imaginable. Not the absence of knowledge, but the presence of it. Not ignorance of what had been lost, but perfect, immortal, unchanging clarity about exactly what it had been and exactly how completely it was gone. He sat on his throne and he endured. And outside the ancient windows of Volterra, the world continued to move through its seasons, indifferent and unhurried, as it always had, and as it always would. Power, when it is genuine and long established, does not announce itself. That is one of the things Marcus had learned across the centuries of the Volturi's rise, watching from his particular vantage point as the coven transformed from an unusually capable and unusually cohesive group of vampires into something that functioned more like a government than a coven, more like a gravitational force than an organization. Power at sufficient scale and sufficient age simply becomes a condition of the world. Other things arrange themselves around it. The question of its legitimacy stops being asked because the asking of it requires imagining an alternative, and alternatives, after enough centuries, become genuinely difficult to conceive. The Volturi had not always been what they became. Marcus remembered the earlier period, the decades before dominance, when the three kings had been simply the most formidable coven in a world that contained several formidable covens, when their authority was real but contested, when other vampires measured themselves against Volterra and occasionally found the comparison not entirely discouraging. He remembered the Romanians, Vladimir and Stefan, who had preceded the Volturi as the closest thing the vampire world had to a ruling power, and who had not surrendered that position gracefully or completely. Their resentment had been immediate and permanent, a cold and focused hatred that Marcus had perceived in their threads every time they came before the Volturi throne across the centuries, unchanged and undiminished by the passage of time, perfectly preserved in the way that only immortal resentments could be. The transition from powerful coven to governing authority had been Aro's achievement more than anyone else's, and Marcus could acknowledge that clearly even across the complicated terrain of everything else he felt about Aro. It had required a particular combination of gifts, not just the abilities that Aro possessed directly, but the strategic intelligence to understand which gifts, in combination, created something more than the sum of their parts. Aro's own power to read every thought through a single touch. Marcus's ability to perceive the truth of every relationship and every loyalty. Chelsea's capacity to shape bonds and manufacture attachment. Dimitri's tracking ability that made escape from Volturi attention a practical impossibility. These were not just individually useful gifts. They were, together, the architecture of a system of governance that was nearly impossible to circumvent, nearly impossible to deceive, and nearly impossible to flee. Marcus's role in that architecture was specific and, in its way, indispensable. He was the verification layer, the final check against which every claim of loyalty or innocence or good intention was measured. When a vampire came before the Volturi claiming allegiance, claiming that some violation attributed to them had been committed by another, claiming that their relationship to a condemned member of their coven was not what it appeared, Marcus could see the truth of those claims in a way that no performance or preparation could entirely defeat. The threads did not lie. They could be obscured in some cases by the deliberate management of emotion and attention, but they couldn't be falsified. The structure of a relationship was what it was, regardless of what either party wished to present about it. He'd used this function thousands of times across the centuries. So many thousands of times that the individual instances had long since blurred together into a general texture of experience, rather than a sequence of distinguishable memories. He remembered categories more than specifics, the particular quality of genuine loyalty versus performed loyalty, and how rarely the genuinely loyal actually needed to proclaim their loyalty aloud. The specific texture of relationships built on fear, which were among the most common bonds he encountered in Volturi governance contexts, and how clearly distinguishable they were from relationships built on real respect or real affection. The way manipulation looked in the threads between people, the slight asymmetry that revealed when one party was managing the other with purposes undisclosed. He had seen covens come before the Volturi, whose apparent unity concealed fractures that would have been catastrophic had they gone undetected. He had identified, in the threads between a coven and their supposed ally, the threads that revealed a planned betrayal that the ally was actively concealing, not just in their words and their expressions, but in their careful management of their own thoughts, knowing Aro's gift and working to defeat it. The thoughts could be managed partially by someone sufficiently disciplined and sufficiently motivated. The bonds could not. Marcus had reported what he saw, and the betrayal had been prevented, and the coven in question had been quietly dismantled. and no one outside the Volturi's inner circle had ever known quite how it had been discovered. These were the moments when his function felt most clearly essential, when the gap between what people presented and what they actually were was widest and most consequential. He had no particular feelings about this work, not in those middle centuries when his emotional range had contracted to its narrowest. It was simply what he did. He observed, he reported, he provided Aro with the additional layer of verification that made the Volturi's judgments something more than educated guesswork. The laws themselves were few and simple, which was part of their effectiveness. The secrecy, the paramount requirement, the thing that the Volturi enforced with the most consistent and the most uncompromising severity. No exposure of the vampire world to the human population. No actions that would draw the kind of attention that could not be managed and contained. This law had practical origins rather than sentimental ones, grounded in the straightforward recognition that the human population, if it became genuinely aware of vampires' existence, would represent an existential threat simply by virtue of its numbers. There were millions of humans for every vampire. Organization and technology and collective determination were things the human world had developed with considerable sophistication. The secrecy was not a preference. It was survival. The prohibition against immortal children was enforced with equal severity, and this was the category of law that produced, in Marcus's experience, the most genuinely tragic cases that came before the Volturi. Vampires who had transformed children out of loneliness, out of an inability to accept the permanent loss of someone small and beloved, out of the particular delusion that the transformation would preserve rather than destroy what they were trying to keep. The immortal children were beautiful, and they were powerful, and they were absolutely uncontrollable, incapable of the discretion that vampire survival required, capable of the kind of destruction that threatened exposure on a scale that no amount of subsequent management could contain. The law was correct. Marcus had never doubted that. But the cases themselves, the parents or guardians who came before the throne knowing they were condemned, the threads between them and their terrible children wound through with genuine love that made the necessity of what had to be done no less devastating to observe. These cases had stayed with him even through the numbness. Even in his most hollowed state, he had found them difficult. His relationship with Caius across these centuries had settled into something that functioned adequately, if not warmly. They were not friends, had perhaps never been friends in the genuine sense, though there had been a period early in the Volturi's formation when something warmer than their current coexistence had been possible. Caius had become, over the long centuries, increasingly defined by his particular hatreds and his particular appetites for the enforcement of the laws, finding in the punitive functions of Volturi governance an outlet for something in his nature that required regular expression. He pursued certain categories of violation with an enthusiasm that went beyond procedural necessity, that revealed a genuine relish for the authority to destroy. And Marcus had observed this in him with the same detached clarity he brought to everything he observed in those around him. He did not judge Caius for it, or rather, he observed the judgment forming in himself and then let it go, the way he let most things go in those centuries. Caius was what the centuries had made him, as Marcus was what the centuries had made Marcus, and the question of what either of them might have been under different circumstances had long since stopped being a question with any practical relevance. What he did, observe with genuine interest of the limited kind he was still capable of, was the difference between Caius's response to immortal pain and his own. They had both been damaged by their long existence, both been shaped by loss and disappointment into something harder and less open than they might otherwise have been. But where Marcus had contracted inward, had become smaller and quieter and more interior, Caius had expanded outward, had transmuted his pain into aggression and his loss into contempt and his grief, if it could be called that, into a generalized hostility toward the world that at least had the advantage of producing energy rather than consuming it. Two different solutions to the same unsolvable problem, Marcus had thought, on the rare occasions when he thought about it at all. Neither of them adequate, both of them functional in their way. Aro remained the most complex presence in Marcus's world, as he had always been. The relationship between them was layered with more history than almost any other relationship in the vampire world, more genuine shared experience, more genuine affection entangled with more genuine betrayal than most bonds Marcus had ever observed in others. He had, across the centuries, arrived at something that was not forgiveness, because forgiveness implied an active decision that he had never quite made, but a kind of acceptance that was perhaps more durable than forgiveness. Aro was what he was. He had always been what he was. The capacity for the thing he had done to Didyme had always been present in him, alongside the genuine warmth and the genuine brilliance and the genuine appreciation for Marcus's company and Marcus's gift. All of it was real. All of it coexisted. Marcus had spent long enough observing the complexity of the bonds between people to understand that human and inhuman nature alike were capable of containing profound contradictions, and that the contradictions did not necessarily cancel each other out. He allowed Aro's affection toward him, such as it was, to function as it functioned. He responded to it in the minimal ways that were sufficient to maintain the working relationship their shared governance required. He did not withdraw from it entirely, because withdrawal would have required more energy than he wished to expend, and because the affection was, at its root, genuine, which meant that rejecting it entirely would have been a form of dishonesty that sat poorly with someone whose entire gift was oriented toward the perception of truth. The high period of the Volturi's authority, those centuries when their dominance over the vampire world was most complete and most uncontested, was in some ways the easiest time of Marcus's post-Didyme existence. The structure of it was rigid and predictable and comprehensive, leaving very little space that required him to generate his own direction or his own purpose. He was part of a machine that ran with considerable efficiency, and his function within that machine was clearly defined and regularly required, and the regularity of it had a kind of numbing comfort that he had learned not to examine too closely, for fear of recognizing it as the poverty it was. He observed the world through the windows of his function, watching the vampire population manage itself around the Volturi's authority with varying degrees of grace and resentment. The Egyptian coven, led by Amun, maintained their independence with a careful and slightly ostentatious dignity that Marcus's gift showed him was genuine in its pride and genuine in its wariness. A coven that respected the Volturi's power without particularly admiring the Volturi's methods. The Irish coven, Siobhan and Liam and their small group, had one of the most genuinely affectionate bond structures among the established covens. A warmth in their threads that Marcus noticed despite himself, that reminded him, despite himself, of things he preferred not to be reminded of. The nomadic vampires, the vast majority of the vampire population, moved through the world in their various configurations, alone or in temporary pairs or small and loosely organized groups, connected to Volterra only by the laws they were required to observe, and the knowledge that violation of those laws had consequences. He watched all of it with a diminished but still functional perception that remained available to him, noting what was relevant, reporting what was required, performing his function with the quiet competence that had always characterized his work, even in his most hollowed periods. He was good at what he did, had always been good at it. The grief had not taken that from him, perhaps because the gift itself was so deeply structural, so fundamental to how he processed information about the world, that even at his most disengaged, it continued to operate with the basic efficiency of a sense that cannot be simply switched off, and the centuries continued to accumulate, each one largely indistinguishable from the last, each one another layer of duration between the man he had been and the threshold from which he now observed the world he had long since stopped expecting to surprise him. He was not entirely correct about that. This surprise, when it finally came, would arrive from the direction he was least prepared for. It would arrive in the form of a bond so clear and so extraordinary that even Marcus, who had spent centuries narrowing his perception to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation with what genuine love looked like, could not look away from it. But that was still some centuries distant. For now, the throne and the stone and the long, undifferentiated patience of someone who had learned to exist without expecting anything from existence at all. The throne room of Volterra saw everything eventually. That was the nature of the Volturi's position at the center of the vampire world, the inevitable consequence of being the fixed point around which everything else orbited. Vampires came to Volterra for many reasons, some voluntary and some decidedly not, and across the centuries the variety of those who passed through the ancient stone corridors and stood before the three kings had given Marcus a comprehensive education in the full range of what immortal existence looked like when lived in conditions other than his own. He had come to think of these audiences as a kind of ongoing census of the vampire world, a continuous and largely unintentional documentation of the different ways that immortal life could be organized, the different solutions that different vampires had arrived at for the fundamental problem of existing indefinitely in a world built for creatures that did not. Every coven that came before the throne, every nomad who passed through seeking guidance or permission or simply acknowledgement, carried with them the specific texture of the life they had constructed, readable to Marcus in the threads of their bonds with the same clarity that a written account might be readable to someone with sufficient language. The nomads were perhaps the most varied population he observed, and in some ways the most instructive, because they represented the default condition of vampire existence. the form that immortal life took when it was not actively shaped by the choice to build something more structured. Most vampires, across most of the centuries Marcus had been observing them, lived alone or in pairs, moving through the human world without fixed location or long-term commitment to any particular place or community. They fed where they found prey, moved when staying became dangerous, accumulated experience without accumulating attachment in the way that the more established covens did. The solitary ones carried a particular quality in their threads that Marcus had learned to recognize immediately. Not loneliness exactly, or at least not what humans meant by loneliness, which implied a lack that was felt as painful and motivating. Something quieter than that, a self-containment that had calcified over time into the only mode of existence the individual in question could still imagine. Vampires who had been alone for a very long time stopped, gradually, being able to conceive of themselves as part of something larger. Their bonds with the world narrowed to the purely functional, the relationship with prey, the occasional territorial awareness of other vampires in their range, and not much else. They moved through the world like stones moving through water, leaving minimal disturbance and being minimally disturbed. He did not judge this, he recognized it. The paired nomads were more interesting to observe, because pairs required negotiation in a way that solitary existence did not, required the ongoing management of two different natures and two different histories in close and continuous proximity. And the bonds that resulted from that negotiation were among the most varied he encountered. Some paired vampires had found in each other something genuine and sustaining, a real partnership that had deepened over decades or centuries into a connection as complex and as layered as any he had observed in the established covens. These pairs had a quality in their threads that was immediately distinguishable, a reciprocity and a depth that spoke of actual mutual knowledge, actual investment in each other's continued well-being that went beyond convenience or habit. Others had paired out of pragmatism and remained together out of inertia, and the threads between them carried that history with complete honesty. A functional partnership, a working arrangement, genuine enough in its way, but lacking the particular quality that Marcus had come to associate with bonds that had been chosen rather than simply fallen into. He reported what he saw when Aro asked him to assess such pairs, using the careful and neutral language he had developed for these assessments over the centuries, and he did not editorialize about the difference between what they had and what they might have had, because editorializing required caring about outcomes that were not his responsibility. The established covens presented a more structured subject of observation. They came before the Volturi for various reasons, primarily to report significant changes in their membership or their territories, to request adjudication of disputes with other covens or with nomads who had encroached on hunting grounds they considered their own, or occasionally to present new members whose gifts were significant enough to warrant formal acknowledgement by the Volturi, the acknowledgement that both confirmed the coven's status and served as a subtle reminder that Aro was aware of every exceptional ability in the vampire world. The Romanians remained a particular and persistent presence across the centuries, Vladimir and Stefan returning to Volterra at intervals that suggested a compulsion they could not entirely resist, a need to confront the entity that had displaced them too strong to be managed simply by staying away. Marcus observed them with the specific attention he brought to relationships defined by long-term resentment, which were among the most stable bond configurations he encountered, because resentment of sufficient age and intensity had a preservative quality, keeping the relationship it defined in a kind of suspended animation, unchanging and self-renewing. Vladimir and Stefan hated the Volturi with a consistency and a clarity that hadn't wavered across their entire acquaintance, and Marcus found this, in its grim way, almost restful to observe. There was no ambiguity in their threads, no complexity to be assessed and reassessed. They were what they were, and what they were had not changed, and the Volturi's response to their presence was correspondingly simple and consistent. The Egyptian coven occupied a more nuanced position in Marcus's ongoing assessment of the wider vampire world. Amun led them with the particular authority of someone who had been a significant figure in the vampire world long before the Volturi's rise to dominance, who carried in his bearing and in his threads the residual pride of an era when his power and his position had not required anyone else's acknowledgement to be real. His resentment of the Volturi was genuine but managed, kept at a level that was compatible with the pragmatic recognition that open defiance of Volterra was not a viable long-term strategy. He maintained the forms of deference while making clear, in ways that were carefully calibrated to fall just short of provocation, that the deference was a choice rather than an instinct. What interested Marcus more than Amun's carefully managed pride was the bond structure of the Egyptian coven itself, which was among the more complex he had observed in any established group. The relationships within it were genuinely varied, some deep and some superficial, some built on real affection, and some on the kind of mutual respect that functions like affection without quite being it. Kebi's bond with Amun was one of the older mated connections Marcus had occasion to observe, worn smooth by centuries into something that had moved past the intensity of its early formation into a quieter and more comprehensive knowing. He had observed that transition in long-established pairs before, the way the acute brightness of a new bond mellowed over time without diminishing, deepening rather than fading, and he had noted it with the specific quality of attention he brought to anything that reminded him, however indirectly, of the thing he had once had and no longer did. The Irish coven, when they came before the Volturi in those middle centuries, carried with them a bond structure that Marcus found both genuinely admirable and genuinely difficult to observe. Siobhan's leadership of their small group was founded on real affection, on bonds that had been built through choice and sustained through genuine mutual investment, rather than through the manufactured loyalty that Chelsea's gift created, or the pragmatic interdependence that characterized many coven relationships. There was a warmth in the threads between Siobhan and Liam and their companions that was immediately perceptible, that had a quality Marcus associated with the best of what he had observed across his centuries of watching immortal relationships develop and change. He reported to Aro what he perceived in their bonds with the careful neutrality that characterized all his formal assessments. He did not mention the warmth specifically, because warmth was not relevant to the legal and political questions that the Volturi's governance required him to address. he noted their loyalty as genuine, their internal structure as stable, their relationship to Volturi authority as appropriately respectful. He folded his actual perception of their bonds into the compressed and functional language of his reports and moved on. The Amazon coven presented yet another variation. Zafrina and Senna and their group had a bond structure shaped by their particular environment and their particular way of existing within it, something wilder and less formal than the European covens, bonds that had been formed in conditions quite different from the careful social management that characterized Volterra's world. Marcos perceived in them a directness that he found, in his limited way, refreshing. They were what they were, without the layers of political performance that accumulated in covens that spent a great deal of time in proximity to power. The question of gifted vampires and their relationship to the Volturi was one that Marcos had observed from the inside for long enough to understand its full complexity. Aro's desire to acquire exceptional gifts for the guard was genuine and consistent, and essentially insatiable. A permanent appetite that colored every interaction he had with every gifted vampire he encountered. Marcos's own gift made him uniquely positioned to observe the threads between Aro and those he was attempting to recruit, to see clearly the distinction between Aro's genuine appreciation for an individual and his strategic interest in their abilities, and the degree to which those two things were sometimes nearly identical and sometimes entirely separate. He had watched gifted vampires come before the throne and feel the particular quality of Aro's attention, that warm and comprehensive interest that was both flattering and faintly alarming if one understood what lay beneath it. Some of them had perceived the nature of what was being offered and had accepted it freely, finding in the Volturi Guard a structure and a purpose that suited them. Others had felt the interest and had retreated from it with varying degrees of success, because Aro's patience was considerable, and his memory was perfect, and his willingness to wait for what he wanted was essentially unlimited. Marcus had observed all of this for centuries without particular investment in its outcomes. The acquisition of gifted guard members was Aro's project, and Marcus's role in it was limited to the assessment function he provided. He told Aro what he saw in the threads, and Aro made his decisions, and Marcus returned to his throne and his narrowed perception and his careful management of a world that he had agreed, implicitly and without ceremony, to help govern without ever quite agreeing to inhabit. The nomads who passed through without seeking formal audience were a different population again, observed by Marcus only when their paths brought them within range of his perception, which happened less frequently than one might imagine given the size of the vampire world and the relatively small proportion of it that had reason to approach Volterra. He gathered information about them second-hand, from the reports of the guard and from the thoughts that Aro gleaned for the occasional visitor who had encountered them in other territories. What he understood about nomadic population, aggregated across centuries of indirect observation, was that the variety of immortal existence was considerably greater than the Volturi's own highly structured mode of life might suggest. There were vampires out there who had found contentment in their solitary wandering, who had arrived at a relationship with their own nature that was genuinely workable and genuinely theirs, rather than imposed by governance or shaped by the presence of others whose needs and judgments required accommodation. There were vampires who had found in the wilderness and in the specific freedom of existence without fixed obligations, something that looked from the outside like peace. He observed these reports with the quiet attention he brought to everything, noting what they suggested about the range of possible immortal lives without drawing any conclusions about his own. The question of what his own life might look like if it were structured differently was not one he entertained, not because he lacked the imagination for it, but because imagination required a certain baseline of investment in the future, a belief that the future was worth imagining, that had been among the casualties of his grief and had not yet shown any signs of returning. The world outside Volterra continued its varied and largely independent existence, and Marcus continued to observe it from his fixed position at the center, and the centuries moved through the throne room with the same steady and indifferent patience that they moved through everything else. He noted, he assessed, he reported. He returned to the particular quality of Volterra's ancient silence, and he waited, without knowing he was waiting, for the thing that would finally require him to look up. Carlisle Cullen had spent time in Volterra. That fact was part of the longer history between the Cullen coven and the Volturi, the foundation beneath everything that came after, and Marcus had been present for it in the way he was present for most things during those centuries, attentive in his diminished way, noting what was relevant without particular investment in its significance. Carlisle had arrived in Volterra sometime in the 17th century, a young vampire by immortal standards, but already possessed of an unusual clarity about what he intended his existence to be, and Aro had welcomed him with the specific warmth he reserved for individuals whose gifts and whose natures he found genuinely fascinating. Marcus had observed Carlisle during those years with the careful attention he brought to anyone who spent extended time within the Volturi's immediate sphere. What his gift showed him about the young doctor was something he had not encountered frequently in vampires of relatively recent transformation. The threads of Carlisle's connections to the world around him had a quality that Marcus associated with much older immortals, a settledness and a coherence that suggested someone who had done the difficult interior work of deciding who they were and had arrived at an answer they genuinely believed. His bond with his own principles, if such a thing could be perceived, had the texture of something structural rather than aspirational. He was not trying to be what he presented himself as being. He simply was it, with a completeness and a consistency that Marcus found. In the limited way he still found things genuinely interesting, worth noting. Aro had been captivated by Carlisle in the way he was captivated by all things rare and genuinely outside his prior experience. The conversations between them had ranged across philosophy and medicine, and the fundamental questions of what immortal existence required and what it permitted. Two intelligent minds engaging with a real disagreement from positions of genuine mutual respect. Marcus had listened to fragments of these exchanges across the years of Carlisle's residency in Volterra, and had found in them something that functioned at considerable distance like intellectual engagement. The question at the center of Carlisle's philosophy whether the abstention from human blood was genuinely sustainable as a permanent mode of existence rather than a temporary exercise in self-denial, was one that had no clear answer in Marcus's experience. He had observed Carlisle's threads with the specific attention his gift allowed and had found in them no evidence of concealed fracture, no hidden weakness running beneath the surface of the commitment that would eventually give way under sufficient pressure. What Carlisle believed about himself and about what was possible, he believed with a completeness that made it functionally identical to truth. What Aro had wanted, and had been careful never to press too directly, was to keep Carlisle within the Volturi's orbit permanently, to have that gift of compassion and that philosophical clarity and that extraordinary self-control available as a resource, as a demonstration of what the Volturi could contain and could represent. Marcos had perceived this desire clearly in the threads of Aro's attention toward Carlisle, the way the appreciation and the strategic calculation were wound together so thoroughly that separating them would have required dismantling both. He had not commented on it. It was not his function to comment on Aro's desires unless directly asked, and Aro had not asked. And so Marcus had simply observed and noted and filed the perception alongside the thousands of other perceptions that accumulated in him across the centuries without producing any particular response. When Carlisle eventually left Volterra to build his own life according to his own philosophy, the parting had been genuinely warm on both sides, which Marcus noted as among the cleaner conclusions to a Volturi-adjacent relationship that he had witnessed. Aro had let him go with the graceful acceptance of someone who understood that certain things could not be kept without being fundamentally altered, and that altering Carlisle would have destroyed the very qualities that made him worth wanting. The door had been left open, in the specific way that Aro always left doors open, with the patient certainty that the world was long, and that what could not be acquired today might present itself again under different circumstances tomorrow. The Cullen coven that Carlisle built across the Atlantic over the following centuries was not something Marcus had direct occasion to observe for a considerable time. Information reached Volterra about them through the usual channels, the reports of the guard and the accounts of nomads who had passed through their territory and noted the unusual configuration of a large permanent coven, practicing a philosophy of existence that had no real precedent in the wider vampire world. What Marcus assembled from these indirect accounts was a picture of something genuinely unprecedented, a coven that had managed to maintain both its unusual dietary philosophy and its internal coherence across decades of existence, growing in membership without losing the quality of genuine family that appeared to be its defining characteristic. He had found this information mildly interesting in the way that genuinely unusual things were always mildly interesting to him, which was to say interesting at the surface level of his perception without penetrating to any depth where it might have required a more substantial response. The Cullens were an anomaly, and anomalies were worth noting, and he noted them and returned to the ordinary business of existing in Volterra without them. The first time Marcus had occasion to perceive the Cullen coven's bonds directly was in the throne room of Volterra, and the circumstances of that perception were among the more extraordinary he had encountered in his long tenure on the throne. They arrived in a state of urgency that was immediately legible in everything about them, in their manner and their movement and the specific quality of tension that the threads between them were carrying, pulled tight with the particular strain of people who were doing something at considerable personal cost, because the alternative was genuinely unbearable. Edward Cullen came first into the full range of Marcus's perception, and what Marcus saw in his threads arrested something in his carefully managed interior life in a way that very few things had managed to arrest anything in a very long time. The bond between Edward and the human girl he had come to Volterra to save. Bella Swan, who had not yet entered the throne room but whose presence in the city Marcus had already been made aware of, was not something he had been prepared for. He had been informed of the basic facts of the situation. The young vampire who had believed his human companion was dead and had come to Volterra to provoke the Volturi into ending his existence. The companion who had travelled with Alice Cullen to prevent exactly that outcome. He had understood the situation in its broad outlines before any of them entered the room. He had not understood what he would see in the threads when Edward arrived. The bond was extraordinary. Marcus used that word with the full weight of what it meant to someone who had spent 2,000 years observing every variety of connection that immortal and human life could produce, who had developed across that time a comprehensive and finely calibrated internal understanding of what bonds looked like at every point on the spectrum, from the most ephemeral to the most profound. He knew what genuine love looked like in the threads, with a precision that went beyond intellectual assessment into something more like direct perception, the way a musician with perfect pitch hears the difference between a true note and a false one, not as an analytical conclusion, but as an immediate sensory fact. What he saw in Edward Cullen was the real thing, and it was the real thing at a depth and with a clarity that placed it among the most extraordinary bonds he had ever perceived in his entire existence. Not a resemblance to profound connection, not a bond with the potential to become something remarkable eventually, something already fully realized, already carrying the specific weight of what it had become, already structured around the central fact of the other person in a way that had reorganized everything else around it. The thread between Edward and Bella was luminous in the specific way that the most genuine bonds had always been luminous to Marcus's perception. Bright not with the surface brightness of new attraction, but with the deeper and steadier light of something that had already been tested, already been through circumstances that would have dissolved anything less real, and had emerged from those circumstances not diminished but clarified. It was the bond of two people who knew each other, who had seen each other at their most difficult and most dangerous, and had chosen each other anyway, and the choosing had been so complete and so repeated that it had become structural, had become the architecture rather than the inhabitant of the connection. Marcus sat with his perception and felt it move through him at a depth he had not been reached at in a very long time. It was not a simple experience. The recognition of the bond's quality brought with it, as it always did when he encountered connections of genuine depth, the specific grief of comparison, the immediate and unwanted awareness of what he himself had once had and would never have again. The thread he had perceived between himself and Didyme, in the years of their bond's full development, had had this same quality, this same particular combination of depth and clarity, and the specific luminosity of something genuinely chosen and genuinely real. Seeing it again in someone else, after centuries of carefully managing his perception to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation, was like pressing unexpectedly on a wound that had never actually closed. He sat with the grief and did not show it, which required no particular effort, because he had spent centuries developing the capacity to contain his responses to what he perceived. He sat with it and continued to observe, because the observation was his function, and his function was what he had, and because there was something else present in the experience alongside the grief that he did not yet have adequate language for. Arrow moved through the proceedings with his characteristic comprehensive engagement, delighted by Alice's gift, intrigued by the human girl's inexplicable imperviousness to Edward's mind-reading ability, managing the room with the smooth authority of someone who had been doing exactly this for 2,000 years and had lost none of his appetite for it. Caius's position was immediate and unambiguous, his threads carrying the cold certainty of someone who had already arrived at a conclusion and was waiting impatiently for the process to catch up with it. The guard held their positions with professional stillness, and the stone room held its ancient silence beneath the weight of the proceedings. When Bella Swan finally entered the room, Marcus perceived the effect of her presence on Edward's threads with a vividness that required a deliberate act of internal management to absorb. The bond intensified in response to her proximity, with the specific quality of something already deep becoming deeper, of a connection that was oriented entirely toward its object becoming fully active, fully present in a way that its object's absence had muted but not diminished. Edward's relief at her living presence was legible in every thread of his being, wound through with a love so complete that it left very little room for anything else. Marcus also observed in those moments the threads of the other Cullens who were present. Alice's bond with Edward carried the specific warmth of a long and genuine sibling connection, real in its affection and real in its mutual understanding. Her bond with Bella was newer, but already had depth, already had the quality of genuine investment rather than mere association. The family's bonds with each other, perceived now at closer range than the indirect information of previous decades had allowed, confirmed and exceeded what those accounts had suggested. Carlisle had built something real. That was the simple and complete assessment that Marcus arrived at, observing the threads between the Cullen family members in the throne room of Volterra. Not a performance of family, not a strategic arrangement wearing the costume of genuine connection, but the actual thing, built over decades of genuine shared experience and genuine mutual choice and genuine investment in each other's continued flourishing. The bonds between them had the specific texture of connections that had been tested and had held, that had been strained and had not broken, that had accumulated the weight of real history and real difficulty, and had been deepened by both. It was, Marcus perceived with the clarity that his gift had always brought to the best of what he observed, something worth protecting, worth the vote he was about to cast. When Aro turned to his brothers, Marcus offered his assessment of the bond with the economy of words that characterized everything he said in formal settings, but with a directness that was slightly more than his usual minimum. He said that the bond was evident, and that its nature was clear, and that the outcome it pointed toward was not genuinely in question. He voted for the girl's life with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen enough of genuine bonds to know what they required and what destroying them cost. He did not elaborate on the fuller texture of what he had perceived. He did not describe the specific quality of Edward's bond with Bella, the depth of it, the clarity of it, the way it had moved through his carefully maintained defenses and reminded him, with a precision that was almost surgical, of the thing he had spent centuries learning to exist without. He did not mention Didyme, whose name he had not spoken aloud in longer than he could easily calculate, whose memory the afternoon's proceedings had brought into unwanted and vivid presence. He simply voted, and the vote was recorded, and the proceedings moved toward their conclusion. The Cullens departed Volterra alive, which was the outcome his vote had contributed to, and the outcome that was correct, and Marcus watched them go with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that had genuinely moved him, which was rare enough that he noticed it as unusual. He watched the threads of their bonds as they moved out of his range, watched them diminish with distance and then disappear entirely, and then sat in the absence of them with the particular quality of Volterra's ancient silence pressing in from all sides. What he had seen in Edward and Bella's bond had done something to him that he had not fully processed, and was not certain he was capable of fully processing. It had confirmed with the absolute authority of direct perception that what he had lost in Didyme was the real thing, the genuine and irreplaceable thing, the kind of bond that came rarely and meant everything and left behind it, when it was gone, a silence that nothing else could fill. He had known this in the abstract for centuries. Knowing it in the abstract and having it demonstrated with luminous clarity in front of him were different experiences, separated by a distance that he had not appreciated until the demonstration occurred. He returned to his throne and sat in the stone cool quiet of Volterra, and held what he had seen in the way he held most things, carefully and without resolution, waiting for it to settle into the ongoing weight of his accumulated experience without requiring anything specific from him in return. Outside, somewhere across the world, the Cullen family was returning to the life they had built, to the bonds that held them together, to the particular warmth of a coven that had chosen itself and continued to choose itself with every passing year. Edward would transform his human companion, Marcus suspected, though the when and the how were details that did not reach him. The bond he had observed would resolve in the only direction bonds of that quality could resolve, toward permanence, toward the elimination of the fragility that mortality introduced into connections that were otherwise built to last. He had seen it clearly, and he had recognized it clearly, and the recognition had cost him something that he could not easily name but could feel as a specific and located weight in the center of his carefully managed existence. It was, he thought, sitting in the ancient silence of Volterra, while the centuries accumulated around him with their patient and indifferent consistency, the price of still being able to see clearly, the price of a gift that had never stopped working, that had continued to show him the truth of the world's connections even through all his efforts to narrow its range and manage its impact. He could not unsee what he had seen, could not unfeel the recognition it had produced, could not return entirely to the careful numbness he had constructed and maintained across the long centuries since Didyme. He was not certain, sitting there in the aftermath of the afternoon, whether that was a loss or something else entirely. He did not, for once, immediately move to resolve the uncertainty. He sat with it in the way that Didyme had once told him she sat with difficult things, fully and without rushing toward conclusion, letting it be present without demanding that it become something manageable before it was ready. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to genuinely feeling something that he had permitted himself in a very long time. The report came to Volterra in the way that most reports came, through the careful network of informants and observers that the Volturi had maintained across the vampire world for centuries, reliable enough in its broad outlines and detailed enough in its specifics to require a response. A new immortal child had been created in the American Northwest, the Cullen coven, whose unusual existence and unusual philosophy had made them a recurring subject of Volturi attention across the decades, had apparently produced or harbored an immortal child, the category of violation that the Volturi enforced with the most absolute and the most uncompromising severity. Marcus received this information in the throne room with the same quality of attention he brought to all reports of significant violations, noting it, assessing its implications, waiting to hear what Aro intended to do with it. He observed Aro's response to the news with his gift operating at the level of attentiveness that significant developments required, reading the threads of his oldest companion's reactions with the comprehensive clarity that 2,000 years of close observation had made available to him. What he saw in Aro's threads was not simple. The response to a genuine immortal child violation was, within the framework of Volturi law, entirely clear and entirely non-negotiable. Investigation, confirmation, and destruction. The immortal child and those who had created or harbored it. The law existed for reasons that were not procedural but existential, grounded in the straightforward recognition that immortal children were an uncontrollable threat to the secrecy that all vampires depended on for their survival. There was no version of the law that included exceptions, no clause that permitted mitigating circumstances, no provision for the particular identity or the particular history of the coven involved to affect the outcome. But Aro's threads, as Marcus read them in the days following the report, carried a complexity that was not entirely explained by the requirements of legal procedure. There was genuine concern there, genuine engagement with the question of what the Cullens had done and what it meant. But there was also something else, something that Marcus's gift identified with the clarity it always brought to the detection of layered motivations. A desire, a specific and focused desire that the situation had activated or perhaps intensified, the desire that Aro had carried with respect to certain members of the Cullen coven, for as long as Marcus had been observing his threads in relation to that family. He wanted their gifts, Edward's ability, Alice's visions, the other exceptional abilities that the Cullen coven had accumulated across the decades of Carlisle's careful and genuinely loving cultivation of people who needed a place to belong. He had wanted them since Carlisle's residency in Volterra, had wanted them through every subsequent piece of information that had reached him about the coven's growth and development, had wanted them in the throne room when Edward and Alice and the human girl had stood before the Volturi and demonstrated the quality of what the Cullen family contained. The immortal child report was, for Aro, not merely a legal matter. It was an opportunity. The framing of it as pure legal obligation was real, in the sense that Aro did not fabricate the law or its requirements, but the enthusiasm with which he embraced the necessity of a full Volturi response, the decision to march in force rather than to send a smaller delegation, the gathering of the most powerful guard members and the invitation extended to allied witnesses. All of this exceeded what the legal situation strictly required. Marcus observed it all and understood it all and said nothing, because saying something would have required an energy and an investment in outcomes that he could not locate within himself, and because Aro's motivations, however layered, were not his to adjudicate. The preparation for the journey to the American Northwest was extensive and took longer than such preparations usually required. Aro was assembling not just the Volturi's own considerable force, but a collection of allied vampires whose presence would serve multiple functions, demonstrating the breadth of Volturi authority, providing witnesses whose testimony would legitimize whatever outcome the confrontation produced, and potentially offering additional gifted individuals whose abilities might prove useful in whatever scenario unfolded. Marcus observed the gathering with the detached attention of someone watching a large and complex mechanism being assembled, noting its components and their relationships without particular feeling about the purpose it was being built to serve. Caius's enthusiasm for the undertaking was immediate and genuine, his threads carrying the specific quality of anticipation that Marcus associated with Caius in circumstances that promised the exercise of decisive authority. He had always been most fully himself in situations that permitted a kind of absolute clarity, where the question of what was required had a clean and unambiguous answer that involved the application of force. The Cullens, with their anomalous philosophy and their human connections and their persistent deviation from what Caius considered appropriate vampire existence, had always represented something that irritated him at a level below conscious articulation. The prospect of addressing that irritation through the legitimate mechanism of law enforcement was something he was finding genuinely satisfying even in anticipation. Marcus traveled with the Volturi toward the American Northwest in the way he traveled everywhere, present in the physical sense and largely interior in every other sense, observing his companions and the landscape and the accumulating details of the situation with the steady and effect-neutral attention that was his established mode. The journey was long by the standards of what the Volturi usually undertook, requiring movement across continents and oceans, and the logistics of it were managed by the Guard with the professional efficiency of an organization that had been performing this kind of coordinated movement for centuries. He thought, during the long passage, about what he had seen in the throne room years earlier, about Edward's bond with Bella Swan, the extraordinary clarity and depth of it, the way it had reached through his carefully maintained defenses and reminded him of things he spent considerable effort not being reminded of. He thought about Carlisle, whose threads he had read in the 17th century and had found more coherent and more genuinely settled than almost any vampire he'd he'd encountered, whose philosophy had seemed then and seemed now like something that deserved a better fate than being dismantled by a Volturi intervention, motivated at least partly by acquisition rather than justice. He did not share these thoughts. They were his, as almost everything significant in his interior life was his alone, contained within the specific privacy of a mind that had learned across the centuries that genuine interiority was one of the few things that could not be taken from him. The clearing in the forest of the American Northwest, when they finally arrived at it, was vast and cold and grey in the particular way of that region's winters, the kind of cold that pressed down from a sky that seemed closer to the earth than the sky had any right to be. The Volturi arranged themselves at one end of the clearing with the precise formation that centuries of such confrontations had established, a display of unified force that was itself a form of communication, a demonstration of what the Volturi represented before a single word had been exchanged. Marcus took his position between Aro and Caius and turned his gift outward toward the assembled figures at the other end of the clearing, and what he encountered stopped him in a way that he had not been stopped in a very long time. The Cullens had not come alone. He had known this, had been informed that they had gathered witnesses, but the information had not prepared him for the full reality of what his gift showed him when he turned his attention to the assembled group across the clearing. The bonds present in that gathering were extraordinary in their variety and their depth, a collection of genuine connections that had been brought together by the specific gravity of what was at stake, by the willingness of many different vampires with many different histories and many different philosophies to stand together because something real was being threatened. He perceived the Cullen family's bonds first because they were the most familiar and the most immediately legible to him. Carlisle and Esme at the center, their connection as warm and as genuine as it had been in the throne room years earlier, deepened further by the years that had passed. Edward and Bella, whose bond he had voted to protect, and whose permanence he had predicted with the confidence his gift warranted. The bond between them now carried a new quality, something that had shifted in the specific way that bonds shift when the fundamental terms of a relationship change, when a human becomes something other than human, and the connection adjusts to the new reality without losing any of its essential character. If anything, the bond was clearer now, freed from the specific fragility that mortality had introduced into it, built now on a foundation that could hold what it carried, without the structural weakness of a lifespan measured in decades. Bella herself, perceived now as a vampire rather than a human, carried in her threads something that Marcus had not anticipated and found, despite everything, genuinely interesting. The bonds of someone newly transformed were usually simple, still forming, still finding their shape and their depth. Bella's bonds were not simple. They had the specific quality of connections that had been built over time and under pressure, tested before the transformation and deepened by it, already fully formed in ways that usually took decades or centuries to develop. Whatever she had been as a human, the transformation had preserved and intensified it, rather than replacing it with the default configuration of a new immortal. He observed the bond between Bella and the child, Renemi, with a particular attention that anything unprecedented demanded. the child herself was not what the report had suggested, not an immortal child in the legal sense that the law addressed, not a transformed human infant, but something that had no clear precedent in Marcus's extensive catalogue of observed beings. Her nature was visible in her threads, in the specific quality of her bonds with the people around her, bonds that carried the specific warmth of genuine feeling and genuine development in a way that the static and uncontrollable immortal children never had. But it was the bond between the child and the young werewolf standing nearby that stopped Marcus entirely. He had observed imprinting before, in the abstract sense of having received reports about the Quileute shapeshifters and the specific bond that their kind formed with particular individuals. He had never had direct occasion to perceive one, had never stood within range of an imprinting bond and turned his full gift toward it. What he saw in the threads between Jacob Black and Renesmee was unlike anything in his catalogue of observed connections, not because it was stronger than the strongest bonds he had perceived in vampires or humans, but because of its specific quality, the particular way it was structured around a future rather than a past, oriented entirely forward, built on the foundation of what was becoming rather than what had already been. It was, his gift told him, with the quiet certainty it always brought to genuine perception, as real as anything he had ever seen, as genuine and as permanent and as completely beyond the category of manipulation or performance as the most extraordinary bonds he had encountered in his 2,000 years of observation. He noted it and held the perception of it with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that genuinely moved him, which remained rare enough to be remarkable. Across the clearing, Aro was speaking with Carlisle, the two of them moving through the forms of the confrontation with the particular quality of a long acquaintance that had never quite become friendship and had never become genuine enmity, bound together by history and by respect and by the fundamental incompatibility of their positions. Marcus listened to fragments of the exchange while continuing his broader assessment of the gathered witnesses, cataloguing what his gift showed him about the bonds and loyalties present on both sides. What he observed among the Volturi's own formation was something he noted with the careful neutrality he brought to potentially uncomfortable perceptions. The allied witnesses that Aro had gathered were not uniformly committed to the Volturi's cause in the way that their presence might have suggested. Several of them had bonds with members of the Cullen family's assembled witnesses that complicated their apparent allegiance, old connections and genuine affinities that the formal structure of the confrontation was suppressing but not erasing. Others were present because the cost of refusing had been too high, rather than because they were genuinely invested in the outcome Aro was pursuing. The formation looked unified from the outside and was considerably less unified in the threads. He also observed, with the specific attention he brought to his own coven's internal dynamics, the threads among the Volturi Guard members themselves. The certainty he might have expected to find, the unified commitment to the proceeding's outcome, was present in some and absent in others, distributed unevenly in a way that suggested the guard's relationship to this particular undertaking was more complicated than their professional presentation revealed. Jane's threads carried her characteristic focused intensity, her investment in the Volturi's authority, genuine and complete. Alex mirrored his sisters with the specific quality of their twin bond, each reinforcing the other's certainty. But others in the guard carried in their threads something more ambivalent, the specific quality of people who were present because they were required to be present, rather than because they had independently arrived at the conclusion that this was right. Marcus noted all of it and said nothing, continuing his function while Aro managed the proceeding toward whatever conclusion he had determined was achievable. The moment when the confrontation shifted came with the arrival of additional witnesses on the Cullen side. Figures who emerged from the forest and took their positions with the quiet authority of people who understood exactly what their presence represented and had chosen to offer it deliberately. Marcus observed the effect of their arrival on the threads of both formations with the specific attentiveness that significant changes in a confrontation's dynamics required. The Cullen side's bonds, already genuine and already coherent, deepened further with the additions, the assembled group becoming more unified rather than more diffuse, held together by a network of genuine connections that constituted something more like a real collective than a temporary alliance of convenience. The Volturi formation's threads shifted in response, not dramatically, not in ways that were legible to ordinary observation, but in ways that Marcus's gift made entirely clear. The ambivalent members was becoming in the threads where truth was becoming, in the threads where truth was visible, something more fractured than its appearance suggested. Aro's threads carried the full complexity of his engagement with the situation. The assessment and the calculation and the genuine uncertainty about an outcome he had expected to control more completely than current circumstances permitted. He was not accustomed to uncertainty in these confrontations. The Volturi's force and the Volturi's authority had combined in every previous engagement Marcus could recall to produce outcomes that were essentially determined before the confrontation began. What was happening here was different. The unified opposition of a large group of genuinely bonded individuals, combined with the specific gifts present on the Cullen side, had introduced a variable that Aro's calculations had not fully accounted for. Marcus observed Aro arriving at the recognition that the cost of proceeding had become genuinely uncertain, possibly prohibitive, in a way that the original assessment of the situation had not anticipated. He watched the calculation adjust in real time, watched Aro's threads shift as the strategic intelligence that had built the Volturi's authority across 2,000 years engaged with the new information and produced a different conclusion than the one the march from Volterra had been organized around. The withdrawal, when it came, was managed with Aro's characteristic grace, framed in the language of legal procedure and of satisfaction with the evidence presented, rather than in the language of retreat. It was not a retreat in any simple sense, and Marcus understood this clearly. It was a strategic reassessment, a recognition that the specific objective that had motivated the undertaking was not achievable at an acceptable cost, combined with the careful preservation of the Volturi's authority and dignity that any outcome needed to include if it was to be sustainable. Caius's dissatisfaction was immediate and legible in his threads, the cold fury of someone who had been prepared for a particular kind of resolution and was being denied it. He managed the expression of that fury with the discipline of someone who understood, even in his most aggressive mode, that undisciplined dissent from Aro's decisions in a public confrontation setting was not compatible with the unified authority that the Volturi's position required. He contained it visibly and with effort, and the effort itself was visible to Marcus as a specific quality of tension in the threads of his containment. As the Volturi prepared to withdraw, Marcus allowed his gift one final sweep across the assembled gathering. A comprehensive perception of the bonds present in the clearing before distance would remove them from his range. He perceived the Cullen family's bonds with the full clarity of close proximity, all of them together, all of them real, all of them constituting the genuine family that Carlisle had spent his long immortal life building with the same patient devotion that he brought to everything he valued. He perceived Edward and Bella standing together in the specific configuration of two people whose bond had been tested at the most fundamental level and had held, whose connection to each other was now as permanent and as structural as anything in their existence. The thread between them was as clear as it had been in the throne room years earlier, and clearer in some ways, deepened by what they had been through together and by the transformation that had removed the last category of difference between them. He looked at them for a moment longer than his function required, with something that was not quite feeling and was more than his absence, and then he turned and followed the Volturi out of the clearing and back toward the tree line and the long journey home to Volterra. He did not look back. He did not need to. The perception of what he had seen was already settling into the accumulated weight of his interior life, taking his place alongside everything else he carried. Another piece of evidence in the ongoing and unresolved case that his existence continued to present to him. The Cullens had survived. The bond he had voted to protect years earlier in the Volterra throne room had survived, had grown, had produced a family that was genuine and coherent and capable of defending itself against the most significant force in the vampire world. The extraordinary thing he had perceived in Edward's threads on that first day in the throne room had resolved, as he had said it would, in the only direction it could have resolved. He walked through the cold forest back toward the waiting transport and thought about Didyme, which was not unusual, because he thought about Didyme with a frequency that the centuries had not significantly reduced. But what he thought was slightly different from the ordinary texture of that grief, slightly less purely painful, and slightly more complicated than the clean weight of loss he had carried for so long. He thought about what it meant that bonds like the one he had observed in Edward and Bella existed in the world, that they were possible. That thing he had once had and lost was not an anomaly, not a single inexplicable exception to the general rule of what immortal existence contained, but a category of experience that the world continued to produce, that continued to exist in the threads of people who were fortunate enough to find it and strong enough to hold on to it. He was not certain what to do with that thought. He carried it back toward Volterra alongside everything else he carried, in the specific way he carried difficult and unresolved things, fully and without rushing toward the conclusion that was not yet ready to be reached. The forest was quiet around him, and the sky above the trees was the particular grey of a winter afternoon moving toward dusk, and Marcus walked through it with the steady and unhurried pace of someone who had learned across 2,000 years that the destination would still be there regardless of the speed at which one moved toward it. There is a particular kind of endurance that has no name in any language Marcus had encountered across his 2,000 years of moving through the world. Not resilience, because resilience implies a returning to shape, a recovery of what was lost. Not survival, because survival implies that the continuation is itself a victory, something quieter than either. The simple, undramatic fact of continuing to exist after the thing that made existence feel meaningful has been removed, of sitting on the throne and using the gift and moving through the centuries without any particular expectation that the centuries will eventually deliver something worth expecting. Marcus endured. That was his story, reduced to its most essential element. He loved and he lost and he endured, and the endurance was neither heroic nor defeated, but simply what it was, the only thing left after everything else had been taken. But there was something else in his story too, something that the long catalogue of his grief can obscure if one looks only at its weight and not at what survived beneath it. His gift never stopped working. Across all the centuries of his withdrawal, all the careful narrowing of his perception, all the deliberate management of what he allowed himself to see, the ability to perceive the bonds between people continued to operate with its essential accuracy. The world continued to show him its connections, continued to offer him in every throne room proceeding and every gathered coven and every pair of vampires standing together in the cold northern clearing of an unexpected confrontation, evidence that the thing he had lost was real, that it existed, that it continued to, was the perception of love. Living in was the perception of love, living in the aftermath of its loss, surrounded always by the evidence of what he could no longer reach. And yet, the gift had also been, across all those centuries, the one thing that kept him tethered to a world he had largely stopped inhabiting. The bonds he perceived in others were the last remaining evidence that existence contained something worth the perceiving, that somewhere in the endless dark of immortal years, the light he had once known was still burning, in other people, in other connections, in the extraordinary and recurring miracle of two people finding each other and choosing each other and building something that lasted. Marcus sat on his ancient throne and carried his ancient grief and continued. And the world, indifferent and generous in equal measure, kept showing him its threads. Rest now. Let these words carry you gently into the quiet. The story of Marcus is complete, and you have all the time in the world to drift, slowly and peacefully, into sleep. Good night.